Matthew Blake stood at the center of his office, gazing out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline of New York City. From this vantage point, he could see everything: his empire, his achievements, the sprawling real estate developments that bore his name. The city had become a reflection of him: cold, structured, and fiercely ambitious. To the outside world, Matthew was a legend, a self-made real estate mogul who had built an empire from the ground up. His name was synonymous with success, power, and unrelenting drive. He was featured on the covers of business magazines, hailed as a genius who knew how to turn any piece of land into a gold mine. His latest project, a luxurious high-rise in Manhattan, was set to break every record in the market. Investors from all over the globe were knocking at his door, eager to be a part of his next venture. Yet, despite all the accolades and the opulence that surrounded him, there was an emptiness inside Matthew that he refused to acknowledge. He had sacrificed everything for his career: family, friendships, love. He didn't have time for distractions. In his mind, emotions were a weakness, a vulnerability that could bring down even the strongest man. So, he built walls around his life and his heart, making sure no one could ever get close enough to hurt him. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when the silence of his penthouse apartment or the isolation of his office would creep in, gnawing at him. In those moments, he would remember his father's words: "What good is building an empire if you have no one to share it with?" Matthew had dismissed those words long ago, believing them to be the ramblings of a man who had settled for less. But now, as he neared 40, with no one waiting for him at home, those words seemed to echo louder. Shaking off the thought, Matthew straightened his tie and glanced at the clock. It was time for a site visit to his newest project, a luxury condominium complex that would soon rise from what was once a forgotten part of the city. His assistant, Rachel, knocked gently on the door, stepping in without waiting for a response. "Mr. Blake, the car is ready," she informed him, her tone as professional as ever. Rachel had worked for Matthew for years, and while she admired his work ethic, she had seen firsthand how lonely his success had made him. Matthew gave her a curt nod. "Let's go." The neighborhood where the new project was set to break ground was a stark contrast to the lavish lifestyle Matthew was accustomed to. It was gritty, worn down, and forgotten by the city's planners. To Matthew, it was an untapped opportunity, a blank canvas that he could turn into the next high-demand area for the elite. As he walked the perimeter of the site, his mind was already calculating the profits, imagining the marble floors, glass walls, and rooftop pools that would soon transform this place. He had done this so many times before, but this time felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense of something not quite right. That's when he saw them, a family huddled together on the side of the street, just outside the fence that marked the construction site. A mother, a young boy, and a teenage girl, their clothes worn and their faces tired. They were the kind of people Matthew rarely noticed, the kind of people his developments often displaced. For a moment, Matthew's gaze lingered on them. He was used to seeing homeless people in the city, but there was something about this family that unsettled him. Maybe it was the way the mother held her son close, her eyes scanning the area as if searching for some kind of hope. Maybe it was the look of innocence on the boy's face, the way he clutched a tattered book in his hands, as if it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Rachel noticed his hesitation. "Sir, should I ask security to remove them?" she asked, already reaching for her phone. Matthew's response surprised even himself. "No, let them be." Rachel blinked, clearly taken aback by his response, but she didn't question him. Matthew rarely acted on impulse, but something in him wouldn't let him look away from that family. His chest tightened, and an unfamiliar sensation crept up. Guilt, maybe? Or was it something deeper? He couldn't tell, and he didn't like it. "Rachel, I'll be back in a moment," he said, his tone firm. Without waiting for her reply, he crossed the street, walking straight towards the family. The mother stiffened as he approached, instinctively pulling her children closer to her. The boy glanced up, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Matthew stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, he felt awkward, vulnerable. "Do you need help?" The words felt foreign in his mouth. The mother's gaze met his, wary and guarded. "We're fine," she replied, her voice firm but weary. There was a dignity in her, despite the worn clothes and the struggle that was written on her face. Matthew hesitated, glancing at the boy who was now staring up at him, his eyes filled with questions. He should walk away, go back to his business, his empire. But something held him there, rooted to the spot. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," he offered, his voice quieter now, unsure. The mother shook her head. "We've tried them all. They're full." For the first time in years, Matthew felt a pang of something he had long buried, compassion. He looked at the boy again, and then back at the mother. Before he knew what he was doing, he made an offer that would change everything. "I have a place," he said, his voice steady. "A temporary apartment. It's not far from here. You can stay there until you get back on your feet." The mother's eyes widened, her suspicion growing. "Why would you do that?" Matthew swallowed, unsure of the answer himself. "Let's just say I owe someone." He left it at that, the weight of his words hanging in the air. And so began the unraveling of Matthew Blake, the man who had everything, but felt nothing, until now. Matthew's heart raced as he walked back toward his black town car, unsure of why he had just offered help to a family he didn't know. He wasn't the kind of man who made impulsive decisions. Yet, there he was, making promises that felt more like a lifeline to them and a burden to him. Rachel stood near the car, her phone in hand, eyes full of questions. But she didn't ask. She knew better than to question Matthew's decisions, no matter how out of character they seemed. Sliding into the back seat of the car, Matthew glanced out the window. The mother was still standing there with her children, watching him as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. He averted his gaze, feeling an unfamiliar sensation gnawing at his insides, something between regret and responsibility. He wasn't used to feeling responsible for anyone other than himself. "Where to, Mr. Blake?" the driver asked, breaking the silence in the car. Matthew hesitated. His mind was on the deal he was supposed to secure later that day, a lunch with an investor that could push his latest project into the stratosphere of luxury real estate. But instead of answering the driver, he pulled out his phone and made a quick call to the property manager of one of his more discreet developments. "Jim, it's Blake. I need one of the units at the Tribeca building cleared out." "Short notice," he said, his voice businesslike, masking the oddity of the situation. Jim, accustomed to Matthew's erratic demands, didn't flinch. "We can make it happen, Mr. Blake." "Temporary?" "Yes, and I don't want anyone else to know about it." "Send me the access code in the next hour," Matthew said, before hanging up. He sat back in his seat, wondering if this decision was going to complicate his life more than it already was. The thought of the board, the investors, his competitors, none of them would understand why a man like Matthew Blake was getting involved with a homeless family. They would see it as a weakness. Later that evening, Matthew stood outside the Tribeca apartment building, his hands in his pockets as the cool air of the city swirled around him. The mother, Julia, approached cautiously with her 2 children, both clinging to her as if they were afraid this was all some kind of mistake. She had been wary on the phone when he gave her the address, her voice guarded but desperate enough to accept. "Is this really okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning the sleek, modern building in disbelief. She was still trying to figure out why a man like Matthew, a stranger, would help them. Matthew nodded, pushing the door open to the lobby. "It's not much," he said, his voice neutral, "but it's a place to stay until you get back on your feet." As they entered the lobby, the polished marble floors and designer lighting felt worlds apart from the grime of the streets outside. The contrast was almost suffocating for Julia, who had spent the last few weeks sleeping on benches, huddled in shelters, and doing whatever it took to keep her children safe. She glanced down at her son, Lucas, who looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. His small hand was gripping her arm tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, all of this would disappear. "Lucas," Matthew said softly, catching the boy's gaze for a brief moment. "You like books?" Lucas blinked, surprised by the question. He nodded shyly, holding his tattered book closer to his chest, the edges worn and dirty. Matthew couldn't quite explain why, but he felt a strange pull toward the boy. Maybe it was the quiet resilience in his eyes, or the way he held onto that book like it was a lifeline in the middle of a storm. Whatever it was, it stirred something in Matthew, something he didn't want to think about too much. The place has a small library, Matthew added awkwardly. Nothing fancy, but you might find something you like. Lucas's face lit up briefly, and Matthew felt a knot tighten in his chest. He looked away quickly, unsure of what to do with this growing sense of responsibility. Julia remained silent, watching the interaction with cautious curiosity. She didn't know what to make of this man. He seemed detached, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with what he was doing. But then again, neither was she. The apartment itself was spacious, with high ceilings, modern furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling streets below. Julia took a hesitant step inside, as if afraid she might break something by just being there. Lucas and his older sister, Emma, followed close behind, their eyes wide as they took in the luxury of the space. "Stay as long as you need," Matthew said, standing near the door. He gestured toward the kitchen. "There's food in the fridge. Essentials. If you need anything else, just let me know." Julia turned to face him, her expression a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." There it was, the question she had been holding back, the one that had been gnawing at her since the moment he approached them. Matthew paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. He could feel her eyes searching his face, trying to find the real reason behind his sudden act of generosity. And truthfully, he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. He only knew that something in him had cracked when he saw them on the street. A crack he wasn't ready to explore. "Call it a debt," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "To someone I used to know." Julia frowned slightly, but didn't press him further. She didn't have the luxury of questioning kindness, no matter how mysterious it seemed. Matthew gave her a curt nod and left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. For a moment, he stood in the hallway, staring at the door as if waiting for some kind of revelation, something that would make sense of why he felt so compelled to help these strangers. But nothing came, just the silence of the empty corridor. Back inside the apartment, Julia stood still, the weight of the last few hours finally sinking in. Lucas wandered over to the couch, sitting down cautiously as if the furniture might reject him. Emma, still clutching her backpack, looked at her mother. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. Julia didn't have an answer. She sat down beside Lucas, pulling him close, her arms wrapping around him protectively. She had spent years running from one place to another, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. This apartment, this moment, felt like a dream. And like all dreams, she feared it would vanish at any moment. "I don't know, baby," she whispered, kissing Lucas's forehead. "But for now, we're here. We're safe. Outside, in the city that never slept." Matthew walked away from the building, his hands deep in his pockets, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't quite control. He had thought this was about balancing some invisible ledger, repaying a debt he didn't understand. But deep down, as he walked into the night, he knew this was about something much bigger than that, something he wasn't ready to face. Not yet. The days that followed were marked by an uncomfortable silence in Matthew Blake's life. He had thought that offering a place to Julia and her children would end whatever unsettling feeling had been nagging at him, but instead, it lingered. He found himself thinking about them at the oddest times, during meetings, late at night in his empty penthouse, even while walking the construction site of his latest project. It was as if they had left a crack in the impenetrable armor he had built around himself, and now, the silence in his life seemed louder than ever. One morning, Matthew stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, his eyes dark and tired. He hadn't slept much in the past few days. His mind kept drifting back to the apartment he had placed Julia and her children in. He wondered if they were okay, if they had found some peace there. The thought frustrated him. He wasn't supposed to care. He had done what was necessary, his obligation to some invisible sense of morality fulfilled. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something much deeper. With a sigh, Matthew grabbed his phone and called Rachel. "Yes, Mr. Blake?" Her voice was crisp and efficient, as always. Get the car ready. I'm heading to Tribeca, Matthew said, his tone leaving no room for questions. He wasn't sure why he was going. Maybe he needed to see for himself that everything was fine, that they were settling in so he could close this chapter and move on. When Matthew arrived at the Tribeca building, he felt a strange sense of nervousness, something completely foreign to him. He was a man who faced billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, yet here he was, feeling uneasy about knocking on the door of an apartment he owned. Brushing off the feeling, he straightened his shoulders and approached the door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing Lucas standing there, his wide eyes blinking up at Matthew in surprise. "Hi," Lucas said quietly, clutching that same tattered book in his hands. There was a hesitation in his voice, like he wasn't sure if he should be talking to Matthew. "Hi, Lucas," Matthew replied, his voice softer than usual. He glanced past the boy into the apartment. "Is your mom home?" Lucas nodded and turned his head to call out, "Mom, it's the man who helped us." A moment later, Julia appeared, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression wary. She hadn't expected Matthew to come back. In fact, she had assumed he'd disappeared just as quickly as he had appeared in their lives. The fact that he was standing there again unsettled her. "Mr. Blake," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "Is everything all right?" Matthew nodded, stepping awkwardly into the apartment as Julia moved aside to let him in. "I just wanted to check in, see if you were settling in okay." Julia's eyes flickered with suspicion. She hadn't dealt with many people in her life who did things out of pure kindness. There was always some kind of catch, and she wasn't naive enough to believe Matthew Blake was any different, no matter how successful he appeared to be. Still, she wasn't in a position to question his motives. Not when she had 2 kids depending on her. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "The apartment is more than we could ever have hoped for." Lucas lingered nearby, watching Matthew with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Matthew noticed the boy's gaze and gave him a small, awkward smile. "Have you been to the library yet?" he asked, remembering their brief conversation from before. Lucas shook his head. "Not yet, but I want to." Matthew glanced at Julia, who was watching the interaction closely. He turned back to Lucas. "Maybe I'll bring a few books next time I come by," he offered, surprising himself with the words. Lucas's eyes lit up, and for the first time, Matthew saw a spark of excitement in the boy's face. "That would be cool," he said, his voice a little louder now, more confident. Julia folded her arms, unsure of what to make of this strange man who kept showing up in their lives. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said quietly, her voice laced with both gratitude and suspicion. "But I won't take charity. We'll figure things out and be out of here as soon as we can." Matthew's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "Consider it an opportunity." Julia's brow furrowed. "An opportunity?" Matthew hesitated for a moment before speaking, his words carefully chosen. "You've been through enough. You and your kids need stability. That's all I'm offering. A chance to get back on your feet." Julia narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "And what do you get out of this? What's the catch?" There it was, the question he had been expecting. Matthew didn't flinch. He had asked himself the same thing 100 times since that day on the street, and he still didn't have a clear answer. All he knew was that something inside him had shifted, something he couldn't quite put into words. "No catch," he said, his voice steady. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be on the edge, even if it doesn't seem like it." Julia studied him for a long moment, trying to see past the polished exterior, the carefully constructed image of success. There was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper story, but she wasn't sure if she believed it. Still, she couldn't afford to turn down his offer. Not when her children were involved. "All right," she said finally, her voice softening just a little. "But don't expect us to stay forever." Matthew nodded, not pushing the matter further. He understood her hesitation, her need to protect herself and her kids from whatever ulterior motive she thought he had. But this time, there was no deal to be made, no profit to be gained. This was something different, something personal. A few weeks passed, and Matthew found himself stopping by the apartment more frequently than he had anticipated. At first, it was just to drop off books for Lucas, but soon, those brief visits became longer, turning into conversations over coffee with Julia while the kids played in the living room. He learned more about their story, how they had ended up on the streets after Julia lost her job, how they had bounced between shelters, always trying to stay one step ahead of despair. She spoke of it all matter-of-factly, with a quiet resilience that both impressed and unsettled Matthew. She never once asked for pity, and she made it clear that she intended to get back on her feet, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. Lucas, meanwhile, seemed to warm up to Matthew more with each visit. The boy had started reading the books Matthew brought him, and he would often sit with Matthew, excitedly telling him about the stories he had read. It was strange for Matthew. He had never had much to do with children, yet there was something about Lucas's wide-eyed wonder that made him want to listen. One evening, as Matthew was preparing to leave after one of his visits, Julia stopped him at the door. "Why us?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the weight of the question. Matthew paused, his hand on the doorknob. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that Julia wouldn't let the matter rest forever. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of something he rarely let show: vulnerability. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Julia blinked, her gaze softening as she sensed the truth in his words. She didn't ask for more details, and Matthew didn't offer them. The silence between them was heavy, but filled with a mutual understanding that neither of them could quite explain. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Matthew shook his head. "There's nothing to repay." As he left the apartment that night, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something he didn't quite understand. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping everyone at a distance. But now, with Julia and her children, those walls were starting to crack. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to rebuild them. As the days turned into weeks, Matthew found himself drawn more frequently to the small apartment in Tribeca. His visits became part of a routine he hadn't anticipated, something that pulled him away from the cold and calculated world of business. Each time he walked through the door, he felt the weight of his corporate empire lift, if only for a moment. Lucas was always the first to greet him now. Every time Matthew arrived, the boy's face would light up with excitement. They would sit on the worn couch together, Lucas eagerly showing him his latest discovery from one of the books Matthew had brought. They had found common ground in the simple act of storytelling, a connection that neither of them had expected, but one that was becoming stronger with each visit. It wasn't long before Matthew realized he was looking forward to these moments with the boy, more than any meeting or deal he had on his calendar. The feeling unsettled him. He wasn't used to being attached to anyone, let alone a child. And yet, here he was, spending more time with Lucas than with anyone else in his life. One late afternoon, Matthew arrived at the apartment to find Lucas sitting by the window, lost in a book. Julia was in the small kitchen, preparing dinner, and Emma was sprawled out on the floor, drawing in a notebook. It was an ordinary scene, mundane, almost domestic, and it struck Matthew in a way that made him feel like an outsider in his own life. He stood at the door for a moment, observing, before Lucas noticed him and waved him over excitedly. "Matthew, look." Lucas held up the book he'd been reading, his face glowing with pride. "I'm almost done with this one." Matthew smiled, walking over to the couch. "That's great, Lucas. You've been reading faster every time I see you." He ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture that felt strangely natural now, though it would have been unthinkable only weeks before. Lucas grinned and returned to his book, content in the silent companionship that had developed between them. Matthew sat next to him, glancing over at Julia, who was stirring a pot on the stove. She caught his eye and offered a small, tired smile, her face softened by the dim light of the kitchen. The apartment was small and cramped, but somehow it felt warmer, more alive, than the vast emptiness of Matthew's penthouse. "Smells good," Matthew said, nodding toward the stove. Julia shrugged, wiping her hands on a towel. "It's nothing fancy, just some pasta. But it's hot and it's enough." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of her reality. She had grown more relaxed around Matthew, though though there was still a layer of distance between them, a protective shield she had yet to lower. Matthew nodded, not wanting to intrude further. He leaned back on the couch, watching Lucas as he read, his small body curled up against the armrest. A wave of unexpected protectiveness washed over him. He had never wanted children, had never even thought about it. His life had always been about building his empire, not creating a family. But seeing Lucas like this, so absorbed in his book, so full of quiet joy, stirred something deep in Matthew's chest. He didn't have time to dwell on it, though, because just then, Emma, Julia's teenage daughter, approached him, clutching a sketchpad in her hands. She had been quiet during most of his visits, keeping her distance, watching him from the sidelines with cautious eyes. But today, she seemed to be gathering the courage to speak. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, her voice carrying the uncertainty of a teenager not used to addressing strangers. Matthew looked up at her, surprised. "You can call me Matthew," he said, his tone gentle, aware of how rarely Emma spoke to him. "What's up?" She shifted her weight, then slowly held out her sketchpad. "I've been working on something. I wanted to know if you could look at it." Matthew took the pad from her hands, unsure of what to expect. When he flipped open the cover, his breath caught slightly. The drawings were remarkable, detailed sketches of people, buildings, and landscapes, all captured with a skill that far surpassed what he had imagined a teenager could do. He could see the precision in the lines, the thoughtfulness in each stroke. "This is incredible," Matthew said, looking up at Emma. "You're really talented." Emma's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "Thanks," she mumbled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's just a hobby. Something I do to, pass the time." "These don't look like something you do just to pass the time," Matthew said, flipping through a few more pages. "Have you ever thought about doing something with this talent? Like, pursuing it seriously?" Emma shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't know. I mean, I'd like to. But that kind of thing costs money, and we don't exactly have much of that right now." Matthew could hear the resignation in her voice, the way she had already convinced herself that her dreams were out of reach. It reminded him of his younger self, back when he was still scrapping to build his empire, long before he had the world at his feet. He had been driven by a fierce determination to succeed, but he had also been alone. Emma, on the other hand, was not alone, not with a talent like hers. "Let me help," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he had time to think them through. Emma blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you're serious about pursuing this, I can help you. There are art programs, mentors, things that could give you a real shot at turning this into a career." He glanced at Julia, who had now turned from the stove, her expression cautious, like she was trying to figure out what Matthew's angle was. No strings attached, just an opportunity. Julia stepped forward, wiping her hands on a towel, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We can't accept that, Matthew. It's too much. You've already done enough for us." Emma's face fell, her dream slipping away as quickly as it had appeared. But before she could retreat back into her shell, Matthew raised his hand, cutting Julia off gently. "This isn't charity, Julia," he said, his voice firm but kind. "It's an investment. Emma has a talent, a real one. I wouldn't be offering if I didn't believe she could make something of it." Julia hesitated, her protective instincts battling with the reality of the situation. She wanted to give her children the world, but she had learned long ago that life rarely gave second chances without a price. And yet, there was something different in Matthew's tone this time. He wasn't making an offer to ease his guilt or to settle some unspoken debt. He genuinely believed in Emma's potential, and that was something Julia hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Emma, sensing the shift in her mother's resolve, looked at Matthew with wide eyes. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew nodded. "Dead serious. If this is something you want, I'll make it happen. You just have to decide if you're ready to take that step." Emma's eyes flicked to her mother, searching for permission, and after a long pause, Julia finally gave a small nod. "All right," she said softly, "but only if Emma wants it." Emma's face broke into a cautious smile, the first genuine smile Matthew had seen from her. "I want it," she said, her voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. Matthew felt a strange sense of fulfillment wash over him, a feeling that had nothing to do with profits, deals, or success. It was something deeper, more human. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but in that moment, he realized that some things were more important than skyscrapers and balance sheets. Emma's potential, Lucas's love of books, Julia's resilience. They were all pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was missing. As the evening went on, the tension in the room eased, the air filled with the smell of cooking and the quiet hum of conversation. For the first time in years, Matthew felt like he was part of something real, something that wasn't measured in numbers or quarterly earnings. He didn't stay long that night, but as he left, walking through the dimly lit streets of the city, he realized he wasn't just helping them. They were helping him, pulling him out of the cold, isolating world he had built for himself. And while he didn't know where this path would lead, he was beginning to understand that some things were worth more than even the largest of empires. Weeks passed, and Matthew's visits to the Tribeca apartment continued, becoming a regular part of his life. The more time he spent with Julia, Emma, and Lucas, the more Matthew found himself pulled into their world. It wasn't just about offering a place to stay anymore. It was about being there, connecting with them in ways he hadn't anticipated. His once predictable routine of meetings, boardrooms, and deal negotiations now included dinners with the family, helping Lucas with his reading, and discussing Emma's drawings late into the evening. Yet, as much as the warmth of their presence drew him in, there was something else stirring beneath the surface. Julia remained guarded, even as she grew more comfortable with his presence. There was a heaviness in her eyes, a weight she carried that Matthew couldn't quite understand. She had mentioned bits and pieces about her past, how she had struggled after losing her job, how they had bounced between shelters, but there was always something she left unsaid. It gnawed at him. There was something familiar about Julia, though he couldn't quite place it. At first, he thought it was just empathy, a strange and foreign feeling for him. But as time went on, it felt deeper than that. Her eyes, her voice. There was a faint echo of a memory buried deep in his past, but whenever he tried to grasp it, it slipped through his fingers. One evening, after a long day at the office, Matthew decided to visit the apartment unannounced. He didn't know why, he just felt a need to see them. The building was quiet when he arrived, and as he stood in front of the door, he could hear the murmur of voices inside. He hesitated before knocking, his hand hovering just above the wood. But then the door swung open, and Julia stood there, startled by his sudden appearance. "Matthew," she said, her tone surprised but not unfriendly. "You didn't say you were coming." He gave her a small smile, feeling unexpectedly self-conscious. "I was in the neighborhood," he lied, stepping inside as she moved aside. Lucas was on the couch, engrossed in one of his books, and Emma was at the dining table, working on a new sketch. It was a peaceful scene, one that made Matthew feel both welcome and out of place at the same time. "Do you want some coffee?" Julia asked, her voice carrying the familiar tone of someone trying to fill an awkward silence. "Sure," Matthew said, nodding. He sat down at the table across from Emma, who glanced up from her drawing and gave him a small, shy smile. Julia moved into the kitchen, and as she did, Matthew's gaze followed her, noticing for the first time the way her shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible burden. It was the same look he had seen on her face many times before, but now, it bothered him more than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him, something important. As she busied herself with the coffee, Matthew glanced at Emma's sketchpad. She had drawn an intricate cityscape, the details of each building captured with the precision of someone who spent hours perfecting her craft. He smiled, genuinely impressed. "You're getting better every time I see your work." Emma blushed, looking down at her drawing. "Thanks. I've been practicing more." Matthew nodded, then glanced toward the kitchen again, his thoughts drifting back to Julia. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken that hung between them. And before he could stop himself, he decided to ask the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Julia," he said quietly, his tone cautious, "can I ask you something?" She looked over from the kitchen, her eyes wary but curious. "What is it?" Matthew hesitated, unsure of how to phrase what he wanted to say. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me. About your past." Julia's hands froze on the coffee pot, her back stiffening. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and Matthew immediately regretted bringing it up. But then she set the pot down, turned, and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed defensively. "Why do you think that?" she asked, her voice guarded. Matthew exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly. "Because you're always holding back, and I don't blame you. I know we don't really know each other. But," he paused, struggling to find the right words, "I feel like I've seen you before. Like we've met, somewhere. I just can't remember where." Julia's eyes flickered with something. Fear, recognition, maybe both. She turned her gaze away, staring at the floor as if gathering the courage to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "We have met before," she admitted, her words sending a shockwave through Matthew. "A long time ago. But I didn't think you would remember." Matthew's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. The faint familiarity, the way her eyes seemed to haunt him. It all suddenly made sense, but he couldn't quite place the moment. "When?" he asked quietly, standing now, his pulse quickening. "Where?" Julia sighed, brushing a hand through her hair as she stepped out of the kitchen and into the living room, creating more distance between them. "It was years ago. We met, briefly. I didn't think it was important back then. But," she glanced at Lucas, who was still absorbed in his book, unaware of the tension in the room. "That's why I didn't say anything when you first offered to help us. I wasn't sure if you'd remember." Matthew felt the air in the room grow heavy, his breath shallow. He took a step closer to her, his mind struggling to connect the dots. "What do you mean? Where did we meet?" Julia swallowed hard, the pain in her eyes unmistakable now. "It was in Seattle. You were there for a project, a hotel you were building. We met at a bar one night." And just like that, the memory hit Matthew like a wave crashing over him. He remembered now. The bar, the hotel project, the night he had drowned his stress in too much whiskey. And Julia, she had been there, a fleeting connection in a haze of business deals and late-night exhaustion. They had talked for hours, something rare for him, and he had felt drawn to her in a way that had scared him at the time. But he had been too consumed with work to let anything come of it. "I remember," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. "But why didn't you?" "Because of Lucas," Julia cut him off, her voice trembling now. "Because I got pregnant after that night, and I didn't think you would want anything to do with it. You were so focused on your work, your empire. I didn't want to be the person who came into your life with a baby you weren't ready for." Matthew's world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at Julia, his mind reeling. "Lucas is my son?" Julia nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she finally let the truth out. "Yes. I didn't tell you because I was scared. I didn't think you would care. And then things got so hard, and I thought it would be easier if you never knew." The room was spinning, Matthew's breath coming in short bursts. He looked over at Lucas, the boy who had unknowingly stolen his heart over the past few weeks. His son. His son. The realization crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt completely unmoored, untethered from the life he had so carefully constructed. He turned back to Julia, his voice shaky. "Why now? Why tell me now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," Julia said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I thought I could keep it from you, that I could protect Lucas from your world. But the more time you spent with him, the more I realized I couldn't do this alone anymore. He deserves to know who his father is." Matthew's chest tightened, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, confusion, guilt, but also something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The desire to protect, to belong, to be more than just a name on a skyscraper. He took a step toward Julia, his voice soft but resolute. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his vulnerability laid bare. "I don't know how to be a father, but I want to try. I want to be there for Lucas, for you." Julia's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope cutting through the fear. She had expected rejection, anger, maybe even indifference. But instead, she saw something real in Matthew's eyes, something she hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. "You're sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Matthew nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm sure. I've missed enough already. I don't want to miss anything else." For the first time in weeks, the distance between them seemed to close, the unspoken barriers falling away. The truth was out now, raw and painful, but it was also a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to create something new. As Matthew stood there, the weight of the past lifted off his shoulders, replaced by the weight of something far more meaningful, the future he had never known he wanted. The apartment felt smaller than ever. The air between Matthew and Julia crackled with the weight of what had just been revealed. Matthew stood frozen, staring at Julia in disbelief, his mind racing to catch up with the bombshell she had just dropped. Lucas was his son. He glanced over at the boy, still completely unaware of the conversation happening behind him. Lucas sat curled up on the couch, his small body tucked into the oversized cushions, immersed in his book as if the world around him didn't exist. But now, Matthew's world had shattered into something unrecognizable. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor snapped him back into the present. Julia was moving slowly toward the kitchen, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass of water. Her face was pale, and her eyes avoided his, as though she were bracing for the storm that was about to come. Matthew's voice, when he finally found it, came out rough, filled with a mix of shock and anger. "How could you keep this from me?" he asked, the question sharp, cutting through the fragile silence that had settled over the room. Julia flinched, her back to him as she gripped the edge of the counter. She took a deep breath before turning to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and defiance. "I didn't think you'd care, Matthew," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with years of suppressed pain. "You were so consumed with your work back then. You barely even remembered me after that night." Matthew's chest tightened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have cared," he shot back, his voice rising. "You should have told me. You should have given me a choice." Julia's expression softened, her defensive walls crumbling just a bit. "I was scared. You were building this empire, chasing your next deal, your next success. I didn't want to be the thing that held you back." "You wouldn't have," Matthew said, but the conviction in his voice wavered. Deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. The man he was back then, ruthlessly focused, obsessed with his goals, might not have accepted the news as easily. He had built his entire life around avoiding distractions, and a child would have been the biggest distraction of all. Julia stepped closer, her voice more measured now, less defensive. "I was protecting Lucas. And maybe in a way, I was protecting you too. I didn't want you to resent him, or me, for showing up in your life with something you weren't ready for." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, pacing in front of the window, his mind spinning. "I missed so much," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was filled with regret, the realization of how much time he had lost. Years of Lucas's life, his own son's life, gone, without him even knowing. "You didn't know," Julia said softly, watching him with cautious eyes. "You weren't given the chance." Matthew stopped pacing and turned to face her. "But I know now, and I don't want to miss anything else." His voice was filled with a quiet determination, a resolve that was unfamiliar to him. He had always been so sure of himself in the business world. But this, fatherhood, was something else entirely. It was terrifying, but it also felt like the most important decision he had ever made. Julia studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. She had expected anger, and it was there, but beneath it was something she hadn't anticipated: commitment. She could see that Matthew meant what he said, that he was willing to step into this role, despite the years he had missed. Her walls, the ones she had built to protect herself from being hurt, were beginning to crumble. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being disappointed still lingered. "Lucas doesn't know," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "He doesn't know you're his father." Matthew's heart skipped a beat. "Why haven't you told him?" I didn't know how, Julia admitted, her voice breaking just a little. I didn't know how to explain why you weren't there. And now I don't know how to explain why you're suddenly here. Matthew's throat tightened. He glanced over at Lucas, who was still sitting quietly on the couch, completely oblivious to the storm that was raging in the room. The thought of that boy, his boy, growing up without knowing who his father was filled him with a deep sense of guilt. But at the same time, he knew that barging into Lucas's life with the truth could shatter the fragile trust they had built over the past few weeks. How do we tell him? Matthew asked, his voice soft but filled with urgency. He deserves to know the truth. Julia nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. I know, she whispered, but we have to do it carefully. Lucas, he's been through a lot. He's sensitive. I don't want to hurt him. Matthew felt the weight of her words, the responsibility pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about profits or deals or success. He was thinking about Lucas, his son, and what it would take to earn his trust, to be the father he had never known. I'll do whatever it takes, Matthew said quietly, his voice steady. I want to be in his life, Julia. I want to be his father. Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. Because once we tell him, there's no going back. You can't disappear again, Matthew. I'm not going anywhere, Matthew said firmly. The words felt like a promise, not just to Julia but to himself. He wasn't the man he used to be, the one who would have pushed this aside for the sake of his career. This time, he was all in. The tension in the room seemed to ease, if only slightly. Julia nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Okay, she whispered. We'll tell him, but not tonight. Let me talk to him first. Prepare him. Matthew agreed, understanding the need to tread carefully. As much as he wanted to tell Lucas the truth, he knew that forcing it too quickly could do more harm than good. Julia knew Lucas better than anyone, and he trusted her to guide this delicate process. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze of normalcy. Julia served dinner, and Matthew sat at the table with them, trying to act as if everything hadn't just shifted between them. Lucas chattered away about his book, oblivious to the emotional weight that hung in the air. Matthew listened, nodding and smiling, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between the past he had missed and the future he hoped to build. As he left the apartment that night, Matthew felt the weight of what was coming settle heavily on his shoulders. He stood outside the building, staring up at the lit windows of the apartment, his heart pounding. For so long, his life had been about control, controlling his career, his success, his image. But now, he was stepping into something far messier, far more uncertain. He didn't know how to be a father, didn't know how to fix the years that had been lost. But he was determined to try. The next day, Julia called him early in the morning. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of apprehension in her words. Lucas and I talked last night, she said. He doesn't know yet, but he knows we need to tell him something important. I thought, maybe we could tell him together, later today. Matthew's heart raced. This was it, the moment that would change everything. He agreed, his voice calm even though his nerves were frayed. I'll be there, he promised. Later that afternoon, Matthew found himself standing outside the apartment once again. This time, everything felt different. His hands were clammy, and his pulse was racing. He wasn't used to feeling this way, uncertain, vulnerable. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his life, and more importantly, this was Lucas's life. When Julia opened the door, she gave him a small, reassuring smile, though he could see the tension in her eyes. Lucas was sitting at the dining table, his book set aside for once, a puzzled expression on his face as he looked between his mother and Matthew. Hey, buddy, Matthew said softly as he stepped inside. How are you? Lucas shrugged, his brow furrowed. Mom said you guys need to talk to me about something. His tone was uncertain, but there was no fear in it, only confusion. Matthew exchanged a glance with Julia, who nodded slightly, signaling that it was time. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to come. Lucas, Matthew began, his voice soft but steady. There's something I need to tell you. Something important. Lucas tilted his head, his curiosity growing. "What is it?" Matthew glanced at Julia again before turning his full attention to the boy in front of him, the boy who had unknowingly become the center of his world. "The truth is, I'm your father." Time seemed to freeze the moment Matthew spoke the words. For a split second, the apartment was unnervingly silent, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for Lucas to process what he had just heard. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he watched the boy's face, searching for any reaction, any sign of understanding. Lucas blinked, his small brow furrowing deeply. He looked up at Matthew, confusion swimming in his wide, innocent eyes. "What do you mean?" His voice was soft, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. Matthew swallowed hard, exchanging a quick glance with Julia, who sat beside Lucas, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She nodded subtly, urging Matthew to continue. He knelt down in front of Lucas, so he was at eye level, his voice gentle but steady. "I'm your dad, Lucas," he said, the words tasting both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "I didn't know it before, but now I do. And I want to be here for you. I want to be a part of your life." Lucas looked between his mother and Matthew, his confusion growing. "But I don't understand. Mom never said anything about you." Julia's breath caught in her throat. She leaned in closer, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "That's true, Lucas. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to explain it. I wanted to protect you. But Matthew is your father. He didn't know until recently, and that's why he's here now, to be a part of your life." The boy's eyes flicked back to Matthew, searching his face, trying to make sense of it all. "But why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice smaller now, his confusion tinged with hurt. Matthew's chest tightened, the weight of the years he had missed settling heavily on his shoulders. "Because I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't know you were my son. If I had, I would have been here. I would have never let you grow up without me." Lucas bit his lip, the uncertainty in his young mind visible in the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. He had always accepted the fact that it was just him, his mom, and Emma. The idea of a father was something he never really thought about. Now, suddenly, everything was different. "Do you want to be my dad?" Lucas asked softly, his voice barely audible. Matthew felt a knot tighten in his throat, emotions swirling inside him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He nodded, his gaze never leaving Lucas's. "More than anything," he said, his voice filled with an unfamiliar tenderness. "I want to be there for you, to help you, to watch you grow up, to be a real father." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes downcast as he processed the flood of information. He glanced at his mother, as if seeking reassurance, then back at Matthew. The room was heavy with the weight of the truth, hanging over them like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. "What happens now?" Lucas finally asked, his voice shaky. It was the question Matthew had been dreading, the one he didn't have a clear answer to. He could plan business deals, negotiate billion-dollar contracts, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment, this delicate, human moment. Matthew exhaled slowly, sitting back on his heels. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said, trying to sound steady even though he felt anything but. "We don't have to figure everything out all at once. But I'll be here, Lucas. I'll be here for whatever you need." Lucas stared at him, his face a mixture of uncertainty and hope, and then, without warning, he stood up from the table and walked away, heading toward his bedroom. Matthew felt a pang of fear in his chest. He had expected questions, maybe anger, but not this quiet retreat. Julia moved to get up, but Matthew held out a hand, stopping her. "Let him go," he said softly, his eyes following Lucas until the boy disappeared into his room. "He just needs time." Julia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know how he'd take it," she admitted, her voice raw. "I thought maybe he'd want this. But now," Matthew shook his head. "He's a kid. This is a lot to take in. He's not going to know how to feel right away." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to suppress the guilt that had been gnawing at him ever since he found out the truth. "I just wish I had known earlier." Julia lowered her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "So do I." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward quiet. Matthew stayed, though part of him wondered if he should have left to give Lucas more space. But he couldn't bring himself to walk away, not now. Not after everything. Julia busied herself in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't need to be cleaned, while Emma sat at the table, her face drawn into a frown, clearly feeling the tension in the air. Matthew kept glancing toward Lucas's room, hoping that any moment the boy would come back out, that they could talk again. But the door remained shut, and with each passing minute, the knot in his chest tightened. It wasn't until well after dinner, when the apartment had settled into a strange stillness, that Matthew heard the soft creak of Lucas's bedroom door. He looked up, watching as the boy stepped out hesitantly, his face still pale but more composed than before. Lucas glanced at his mother, then at Matthew, his eyes full of questions he didn't know how to ask. I'm not mad," Lucas said quietly, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Matthew's heart ached at the vulnerability in his son's voice. He stood slowly, careful not to move too quickly, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over them. "I'm glad," he said gently, taking a cautious step toward the boy. "I didn't want to hurt you, Lucas. I want to be honest with you." Lucas nodded, fidgeting with the sleeve of his shirt. "It's just weird. I didn't think I had a dad. And now you're here." "I know," Matthew said softly, kneeling down again so he could look Lucas in the eye. "It's weird for me too, but I want to make it right. I want to be the dad you deserve." Lucas hesitated for a long moment, his small face etched with uncertainty. Then, to Matthew's surprise, the boy took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His voice was small, unsure, but there was a flicker of hope in his words. Can we start slow?" Lucas asked, his wide eyes searching Matthew's face. "Like, maybe you can just come over sometimes? Or we could hang out." Matthew smiled, relief flooding through him like a wave. "Of course, we can go as slow as you need." Lucas gave a small nod, and for the first time that night, his face softened into a tentative smile. It wasn't a big smile, just a small flicker of warmth, but it was enough to make Matthew's heart swell with a feeling he hadn't expected. It wasn't the same rush he got from closing a deal or seeing his name in the papers. It was something deeper, something real. Over the next few days, Matthew and Lucas began to forge a new kind of relationship. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where Lucas seemed unsure of how to act around Matthew. But slowly, they found their rhythm. Matthew began visiting the apartment more frequently, spending time with Lucas, reading books together, or just talking about whatever was on Lucas's mind. Each visit felt like a step forward, a small but significant move toward building the bond Matthew had missed out on for so many years. But even as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that the balance in his life was beginning to shift. His work, once his sole focus, now seemed distant, less important. He found himself canceling meetings, pushing off deadlines just to spend a few extra hours with Lucas. It was a dangerous line to walk. His empire required his full attention, but his son needed him in a way that no business deal ever could. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Matthew arrived at the apartment to find Lucas waiting for him at the door. The boy's face lit up when he saw him, and Matthew felt a rush of warmth that he hadn't expected. "Hey, Matthew," Lucas called out, waving him in. "Hey, buddy," Matthew replied, his voice softening with affection. "What are you up to?" "I was just waiting for you," Lucas said, his smile wide. "I wanted to show you this new book I got from the library." Matthew smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and happiness. "I can't wait to see it." As they walked inside, side by side, Matthew realized that while the path ahead would be full of challenges, he was no longer walking it alone. For the first time in his life, he had something more important than his career. He had a family, and that was a future worth fighting for. The days following Lucas's tentative acceptance of Matthew were marked by a fragile peace. Their relationship was growing, slowly but surely, with each visit feeling a bit more natural, a bit more like family. Matthew couldn't remember the last time he had felt so invested in something that wasn't a business deal or a financial conquest. But the more time he spent with Lucas, the more he realized just how much he had missed. There were moments when Lucas would light up, sharing a story or a new book he was reading. And in those moments, Matthew saw a glimpse of what being a father could feel like. But then there were other moments, quiet, uncomfortable moments, when Lucas would retreat, unsure of how to act around the man who was suddenly part of his life. The boy was trying to navigate a world that had changed overnight, and Matthew could sense his hesitancy, his fear that this newfound relationship could disappear just as quickly as it had appeared. And Matthew understood that fear, because it was something he felt too. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room of the Tribeca apartment, Lucas was showing Matthew a drawing Emma had done of a cityscape, something she had been working on for weeks. The detail was astonishing, each line crisp and precise, capturing the essence of the city in a way that only someone with a keen eye for beauty could. "She's really good, isn't she?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with admiration for his older sister. Matthew nodded, smiling as he admired the drawing. "She's got real talent. I've been thinking about helping her get into some art programs, something that could really take her to the next level." Lucas looked up at him, wide-eyed. "You think she could be famous one day?" "I think she could be anything she wants," Matthew replied softly. He watched as Lucas studied the drawing, his expression thoughtful. It was moments like these that made everything feel right, like the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. But as much as Matthew wanted to embrace this new chapter, there was a storm brewing beneath the surface. His work had started to slip. Deadlines were being pushed back, important meetings rescheduled, and whispers were beginning to circulate among his business partners and employees. The once untouchable Matthew Blake, the man who had built an empire on his relentless drive and ambition, was suddenly distracted. And in his world, distraction was dangerous. The phone rang late one evening while Matthew was sitting in his office, poring over blueprints for an upcoming development. It was Rachel, his assistant, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "Matthew, you need to come to the office tomorrow," she said. "There's been some talk. The board is worried." Matthew sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had been expecting this. "What are they worried about?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They think you've been unfocused," Rachel said carefully, her tone diplomatic. "There are rumors that you're not as involved as you used to be, that some deals might be slipping through the cracks." Matthew leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city lights. The skyline, which had once been a symbol of his power and success, now felt like a distant memory, a reminder of the life he had been so immersed in before everything changed. "I'm handling it," he said, though even he didn't believe the words. "Are you?" Rachel's voice softened, the professionalism fading into concern. She had known Matthew for years, had seen him rise to the top through sheer force of will. But this was different. "You've been distant, Matthew. People are starting to notice." Matthew rubbed his temples, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to juggle everything without letting a single ball drop. But now, for the first time, he was starting to feel the cracks in his foundation. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, something was going to give. "I'll be in tomorrow," he said finally, his voice tight. "We'll handle it." When the call ended, Matthew sat in silence for a long time, the hum of the city filling the empty space around him. He was at a crossroads, and he knew it. For the first time in his life, he was being pulled in two directions, toward the empire he had built with his own hands, and toward the family he had just discovered. The next morning, Matthew walked into the sleek glass tower that housed his real estate empire. The office was as polished and pristine as ever, the familiar sight of assistants rushing around and phones ringing creating a sense of order, of routine. But as he stepped into the boardroom, he could feel the tension in the air. The board members, all seasoned investors and business minds, were seated around the long conference table, their expressions stern. "Matthew," one of the senior partners said as he entered, his tone heavy with unspoken judgment. "We need to talk." Matthew sat down, bracing himself for what was coming. "You've been slipping," the partner continued. "We've all seen it. Meetings delayed, deals pushed back. This is not the Matthew Blake we know. You've built this company with precision, with focus, But lately, it feels like your priorities are elsewhere. Matthew clenched his jaw, his mind racing to come up with a response that would reassure them without making promises he couldn't keep. I'm still here, he said, his voice cool. And the company is still on track. We've got 3 major projects in development, all moving forward. But at what cost? Another partner chimed in. We've heard rumblings from clients, concerns about your lack of involvement. You've been distracted, Matthew. What's going on? For a moment, Matthew considered telling them the truth, that his life had changed, that he was trying to be a father for the first time, that he was no longer the man who could dedicate every waking moment to his work. But he knew that wouldn't go over well. These men had invested in him because of his relentless focus, his ability to put business above all else. I'm handling it, he repeated, his voice firm. I'll make sure everything gets back on track. The partners exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced. But before they could press further, Matthew's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but then it buzzed again and again. Something in his gut told him to check. Excuse me, he muttered, pulling out his phone. It was a message from Julia, and as he read it, his blood ran cold. Asterisk Lucas is sick. I'm taking him to the hospital. He's asking for you. Asterisk Matthew's heart leapt into his throat. He stood abruptly, causing the board members to look at him in confusion. I have to go, he said, his voice tight. Matthew, we're in the middle of something important here. One of the partners snapped, clearly irritated by his sudden departure. I said, I have to go, Matthew repeated, his eyes hard. He didn't wait for their response. He was already moving, his mind solely focused on getting to Lucas. The hospital was a blur of white walls and antiseptic smells when Matthew arrived. He rushed through the corridors, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was racing with worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last. He had never been this scared in his life, not even during the most high-stakes deals. When he finally found Julia in the waiting room, her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She stood when she saw him, her hands wringing together nervously. What happened? Matthew asked, his voice shaky. He had a fever last night, Julia said, her voice trembling. I thought it would pass, but it got worse. I brought him here as soon as I could. They're running tests now. Matthew's stomach dropped. Is he okay? Can I see him? Julia nodded, motioning toward the door down the hall. He's asking for you. Matthew pushed through the door, his breath catching when he saw Lucas lying in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the sterile white sheets. His face was pale, and an IV was attached to his arm. But when Lucas saw Matthew, a faint smile crossed his lips. Hey, buddy, Matthew said softly, sitting down beside the bed, his heart breaking at the sight of his son like this. Hey, Matthew, Lucas whispered, his voice weak. You came. Of course I did, Matthew said, his voice filled with emotion. I'll always come, Lucas. I'm not going anywhere. Lucas smiled weakly, and for the first time since he had arrived, Matthew felt a sense of calm wash over him. No matter what was happening at work, no matter what pressures awaited him, nothing mattered more than this. He reached out and took Lucas's small hand in his own, squeezing gently. You're going to be okay, he whispered, his voice firm but gentle. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. As Matthew sat there, holding Lucas's hand, the weight of his double life finally became clear. He couldn't keep pretending that he could balance everything. Something had to give, and for the first time, he knew exactly what that something was. His empire could wait. His son couldn't. The hospital room hummed with the soft beeps of medical equipment, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to the air. Matthew sat by Lucas's bedside, his son's small hand still resting in his own. Time seemed to move differently here, slowly stretching out as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Lucas had drifted off to sleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. But Matthew's mind was anything but calm. He couldn't stop the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. Seeing Lucas like this, so small, so vulnerable, had shaken something deep within him. It was a moment of clarity, a reckoning with the reality he had been avoiding for weeks. His life, his empire, his relentless pursuit of success, It all felt so insignificant now. In this room, with his son lying in that hospital bed, none of it mattered. Julia sat in a chair across the room, her body slouched from exhaustion, her eyes hollow from worry. She had been the strong one through all of this, holding Lucas's hand, reassuring him that everything would be all right. But Matthew could see the cracks forming in her armor. She was terrified, just as he was. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, his thoughts drifting to the conversation he had stormed out of that morning. The boardroom, the disappointed looks on the faces of his business partners, the thinly veiled accusations of distraction. They had every right to be concerned. Matthew hadn't been himself in months. He had been juggling two lives, trying to keep one foot in the world of high-stakes real estate, while the other was firmly planted in this new life with Lucas and Julia. And he had failed at both. The truth was painfully clear now. Something had to give. As if sensing his turmoil, Julia lifted her head and looked at him. There was a question in her eyes, one she had been holding back since the moment they had brought Lucas to the hospital. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but filled with concern. Matthew hesitated, unsure of how to answer that question. No, he wasn't okay. Nothing about this situation was okay. But at the same time, he knew that this was the moment where everything needed to change. He couldn't keep pretending that he could have it all. The empire, the family, the life he had worked so hard to build. Something had to give, and he knew exactly what it was. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "about everything, work, my life." Lucas, Julia sat up a little straighter, her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened. "I can't keep doing this, Julia," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't keep trying to be in two places at once. It's not fair to Lucas. It's not fair to you." She didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Matthew feared she might misinterpret his words, that she might think he was about to walk away from them. But then, she gave him a tired smile, one filled with understanding. "You don't have to choose between us and your work, Matthew," she said softly, her voice filled with kindness. "We're not asking you to give up everything you've built." But Matthew shook his head, cutting her off. "I do have to choose. I've spent my entire life chasing success, building something that I thought mattered. And for a long time it did. But now," he glanced at Lucas, sleeping peacefully under the soft glow of the hospital room's fluorescent lights. "Now I realize that none of that means anything if I lose him. If I lose you." Julia's eyes softened, a flicker of emotion passing over her face. "You won't lose us, Matthew. But you don't have to give up everything for us either." Matthew took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "I'm not giving it up," he said quietly, "but I'm stepping back. I can't keep running at the same pace I have been. I need to be here for Lucas. I need to be here for you. And I'm ready to make that sacrifice." Julia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. For the first time in a long time, Matthew was sure of his decision. "You're really ready for that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew nodded. "Yes, I am." A few days later, Lucas was discharged from the hospital, his fever finally under control and the doctors assuring them that it was nothing more serious than a bad viral infection. The relief that washed over Matthew and Julia was palpable, but even after leaving the hospital, the reality of their new life weighed heavily on them both. Matthew kept his word. He didn't disappear into the world of business as he had before. Instead, he made a decision that sent shockwaves through his company. He was stepping down as CEO, turning over the reins to a trusted colleague who had been with him since the early days of his empire. It wasn't an easy decision. His identity had been tied to his success for so long that the idea of letting go felt almost impossible. But the moment he walked away from that office for the last time, he felt lighter, freer. He hadn't fully left the company. He remained on the board and kept some involvement in key projects. But the day-to-day pressures, the constant grind of staying on top, those were gone. Now, he had something more important to focus on: his family. Back at the Tribeca apartment, things began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't always easy. Lucas was still adjusting to the idea of having Matthew in his life as his father, not just a man who visited occasionally. There were moments of awkwardness, moments when Lucas would pull back, unsure of how to navigate this new relationship. But with each passing day, they grew closer. Matthew was patient, more patient than he ever thought he could be. He showed up, day after day, proving to Lucas that he wasn't going anywhere. He helped with homework, took him to the park, and even showed up at school events, something that had been completely foreign to Matthew just months earlier. The more time he spent with Lucas, the more he realized that this was what life was supposed to feel like. Emma, too, was flourishing. With Matthew's help, she had applied to several prestigious art programs, and when she received her first acceptance letter, the pride in her eyes was unmistakable. Matthew had made good on his promise to support her dreams, and seeing her light up with hope for the future made every sacrifice worth it. And then there was Julia. Their relationship had shifted, deepened, in ways neither of them had expected. At first, there had been a careful distance between them, both unsure of how to navigate the new dynamic of co-parenting and their complicated past. But over time, that distance began to close. They shared quiet moments, late-night conversations after the kids were asleep, walks through the city where they talked about their hopes, their fears, their future. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of the apartment, looking out at the city lights, Julia leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You really gave it all up for us," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. Matthew smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "No," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I didn't give anything up. I just found something better." Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with warmth, and in that moment, Matthew knew. This was his life now. Not the empire, not the skyscrapers, not the relentless pursuit of more. This was where he belonged. As they stood there, watching the city stretch out before them, the future felt wide open, full of possibility, full of hope. Matthew had found his balance. He had found his family, and for the first time in his life, he felt whole.